One of my favorite SNL sketches begins with this screen crawl. 100,000 years ago, a caveman was out hunting on the frozen wastes when he slipped and fell into a crevasse. In 1988, he was discovered by some scientists and thawed out. He then went on to law school and became unfrozen caveman lawyer. So I wasn't watching SNL back at the time, but I've seen this sketch 100 times, and I don't know when I first saw it, but I've never forgotten it. I believe it's some of Phil Hartman's best work, and can only be done with this most arrogant voice that he has. Phil Hartman plays a Neanderthal-looking individual named Kirok, and he's made to look overly stereotyped, like what we might have thought a caveman looked like, with a massive brow, dark sunburned skin, and major oversized features. He begins his final arguments in a trial saying, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm just a caveman. Your world frightens and confuses me. Sometimes the honking of your horns in traffic makes me want to get out of my BMW and run into the hills or whatever. Sometimes when I get a message on my fax machine, I wonder, did little demons type it? I don't know. My primitive mind can't grasp these concepts. But there is one thing I do know. When a man like my client slips and falls on a sidewalk in front of a public library, he is entitled to no less than $2 million compensatory damages and $2 million punitive damages." And then he ends his final words to the jury, which doesn't even have to deliberate, because, as they said, his words now were just as reasonable as they were back in his time. This caveman is such a cartoonish stereotype that his arrogance is comedy gold. He uses his faux simplicity, his folksiness, to garner the jury's sympathy with a verdict that will end up being on his side. Now, in the years since this sketch, we have completed the Human Genome Project and expanded our understanding of evolutionary biologies. And with the internet, we individually have better access to the reality of our human ancestry than the caveman lawyer did. This isn't to say that when this skit first came out, we didn't have good information. It was just to say our understanding is now more accessible. A long, long time ago, in the same year that The Godfather and Back to the Future trilogies came to a close, two of the greatest movies ever made came out: Tremors, starring Kevin Bacon, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But we set out as a people on an important journey for our species. I apologize, I'm struggling over my words today. We would map the human genome. I remember when this was going on. I didn't understand what was happening, but I remember it. I heard that we would never finish it, and then I heard exciting speculation on what they would find if they did. And after about 13 years, in April 2003, when House of a Thousand Corpses was released, the human genome was declared complete at 92%. It was finally fully mapped in 2022. However, we do continue to add our understanding and knowledge and wisdom to this genome in the years that have followed. We've not just stopped at the learning, we've started to understand what these genes might very well be doing. We continue to find more and more depth in its tones and in its language. Of course, That's not to say we know what these genes do. But unlocking the genome does help us build better medicine, treat disease better, and as a minister, it unlocks something special for me about who we are. We are able, even if we don't understand it all, to see our basic programming. And I must admit, this is a very humbling idea. See, studying the human genome helps us better understand our genetic heritage. We already know that cells have a nucleus in the middle. That nucleus contains chromosomes, which are made up of genes, which are made up of long strings of DNA, which is a combination of amino acids, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. But I'd like to begin my story this morning with one specific chromosome. Some of you may know it, but I had forgotten that the human being is made up in our DNA of 23 chromosome pairs. So 46 chromosomes in general. Chimpanzees have a set of 24 chromosomes. Now, generally numbers mean very little in this equation. Like female ants have 2 chromosomes, males have 1, and the woolly mammoth has 58 pairs. It's not the number of chromosomes, it's how we use them. But what's striking about human and chimpanzee genome is that 22 of the chromosomes line up identically. But what's even cooler is the difference. In sequencing the genome, we notice something strange. Chromosome 2. So chromosome 2 in humans looks like 2 chromosomes from the chimpanzee genome. And it looks like they've been glued together end to end. Which means that at some point between 4 and 13 billion years ago, a mutation took place in the genome and created a new species. We can tell this is a mutation or a fusion because the human gene contains vestigial markers. Basically, just like humans have vestigial organs, like an appendix or wisdom teeth, our genes also have vestigial markers that are very clear. Now, I feel like I dropped a lot in one paragraph. In not being a biologist or a geneticist, I only have a general understanding. It might come out later that I've given some information wrong, but I apologize if that's the case. I only understand I'm just a caveman. But my point is simple. Maybe even too simple. We are great apes. And we have a common ancestor to chimpanzees. And that common ancestor or ancestors had a mutation in their genome that might initially be recessive, but then would become very active, common, until it was no longer a mutation but a dominant trait. And for some reason, not because of this mutation, but because a species with this mutation flourished, or families with this mutation flourished, a new branch of hominids would begin to walk the earth. They would walk upright. Australopithecus would give way to Homo habilis, who would give way to Homo erectus, and Homo heidelbergensis would split off into multiple branches that would walk the earth at the same time. Homo neanderthal and the Denisovians and the cousins, these would become cousins to what would later be known as Homo sapien. And they would build great cities. They would go to war with each other. They would fall in love, study art and science. They would look to the skies, asking the question, why? Why are we here? Are we alone? Is anyone out there? They would try to understand why floods came in some places but not in others. They would try to figure out why fire and plague would ravage some people but not others. They would call on their gods for peace, for food, for victory over those who had what they needed to survive. Some of that species would come would go on to become great leaders: Nimrod, Gilgamesh, Ramses, Cyrus, Alexander, Caesar. Others would become artists and poets, and some prophets and philosophers would seek to guide not the physical world around them, but the mental and spiritual world within. Some would bring peace, others would bring the sword. Some would realize sooner than others that the magic that they had known for millennia could actually be organized into a science. They would look at the skies and they would realize maybe we can predict these floods sometimes, not because we're magic, but because we can understand our seasons if we take notes. They would build carriages, boats, big boats. They would sail across great oceans. Empires would continue to rise and fall. This people would tame the skies with planes and would even leave this blue boat tied to, since before they could speak, even if just for a moment. And they would forget their cousins, the Neanderthals and the Denisovians. They would forget those first steps Homo erectus took, the last steps of Australopithecus. They would forget their parents with the mutant gene. They would forget that even at one time the chimpanzees could have been considered their siblings. They would forget that they were connected to all the life on this great boat they call Earth. Until one day they would be reminded that we are more alike than we are different. Reminded that we are more the same than we are separate. Reminded that we have a common ancestor, not just with the apes, but with everything. And instead of hearing the message of Charles Darwin when he said, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Instead of understanding Darwin's grandeur, the egos of men would rage against its own kinship. Because for them it was not special enough to be part of something, but must instead be the head of everything. At some point, some of the species decided that if they could not be set apart, they would burn it down. But let's take a minute, an interlude, if you may, and I'm going to change the subject. And just for a moment, we want to discuss a new wave band that formed in Akron, Ohio, circa 1973, called Devo. I'm sure most of you know Devo, as the band came out. The band came out with a hit song in the 1980s called Whip It. And just in case this wonderful group of Unitarians is unaware of the band Devo, I mean, maybe one or two of you might not know who they are. They use nonsense. They're an absurdist, surrealist, new wave band that uses nonsensical lyrics. They wear these weird red hats called Energy Dome hats. I tried to find one for this sermon, and I could not. But an idea of the sarcasm that they use that's buried in their language, you can look at the lyrics to the word whip it that tells us how to address our problems. When a problem comes along, you must whip it. Before the cream sets out too long, you must whip it. When something's going wrong, you must whip it. But I'm not sure if Devo's song Whip It is appropriate for a church pulpit. So I'm going to shelve that for just a minute and talk about a different song called Jocko Homo. To understand Jocko Homo, the song by Devo, you must first understand what Devo means to Devo. Devo is a shortening of the phrase de-evolution and highlights the grim view that humanity is de-evolving. Now understand, I don't mean scientifically, because scientifically that's a misnomer. Humankind, nothing can de-evolve. Evolution is a forward motion. But having said that, from a social perspective, looking around, well, Devo puts it this way. They tell us that we lost our tails, evolving up from little snails. I say it's all just wind and sails. Are we not men? We are Devo. Are we not men? D-E-V-O. So the title, Jocko Homo, is a deep cut from a Pentecostal religious tract published in 1924 by a guy named B.H. Shattuck. And he entitled this religious tract, Jocko Homo, the Heaven-Bound King of the Zoo. And just in case you're curious about it, it's a tract about not just the sinful nature of humanity, but the fact that under his understanding, we did not evolve from monkeys. And throughout the song, Devo uses satire to make reference to other medias, not just this tract, and other books to draw conclusions about humanity that we are de-evolving. Not necessarily in the evolution way, but in rejection of moving forward with a better understanding. In direct response to the lyrics from 1926 anti-evolution song, and this is why I appreciate Devo, they make reference to a guy named Uncle Dave Macon who's got a song called The Bible Was Right. And in the song, he says, there ain't no man from anywhere going to make a monkey out of me. To this, in direct response, Devo sings, we go now, God made man. But he used the monkey to do it. Apes in a plan. We're all here to prove it. I can walk like an ape, talk like an ape. I can do what a monkey can do. God made man, but a monkey supplied the glue. So let's talk about the point of my sermon for a minute. We know, all of us sitting here, many of the connections we have with the world around us. I do not have to defend chromosome 2 to you. I do not have to defend evolution or the concept that we evolved through some Darwinian concept that I can't explain well enough to prove to you anyway. I don't have to prove that to you. This is a Unitarian Universalist church. I can say thank God for evolution and throw just the weird, that's just a weird concept for Unitarians, right? Thank God for evolution. I know that, and the thing is, I know these things only because I looked them up while writing my sermon. So in 3 weeks, if you ask me about chromosome 2, I'll probably look at you dumb. But here's the thing. I have to work at this understanding of science, at where we came from, at who we are, at how we relate to each other, at how we relate to the world around us. And I'm okay doing that. I love doing that because the mystic in me, which probably aggravates a lot of the scientists around me, doesn't fret at the understanding. Because I've spent most of my life feeling alone, knowing that we have a common heritage. Well, shoot, that's one of the most meaningful things I can think of. See, like Darwin, for me, there is a grandeur in this view of life. This view of life that we came from somewhere. That we are not separated. This view of life that we decide how we view one another, but we can't argue the fact we are connected. It's easy to look around at the world and see only the segregation. But see, there is this elegant unity written in our DNA a common heritage. But because of the brain that we were born with, for some reason, we have to choose to engage that common heritage. To see the people around us, whether we like them or not, whether we agree with them or not, whether they agree with us or not, as kin, as family. And this common heritage makes that step a little easier for me. So like Darwin, I look upon this world with a sense of grandeur. Thank you so much for listening.